Marcus Thompson had always been proud of his military service. 23 years in the Marines had taught him discipline, respect, and the value of following orders. Now, at 51, he worked as a security supervisor at Memorial Hospital in downtown Chicago. His uniform was always pressed, his boots polished, and his bearing unmistakably military. On a cold Tuesday morning in November, Marcus arrived at work earlier than usual. The hospital was quiet except for the soft hum of machines and the distant chatter of the night shift staff finishing their rounds. He made his way to the security office, checking in with the overnight guards before beginning his rounds. The hospital had been his workplace for 8 years now. He knew every corner, every hallway, and most of the regular staff. Doctors and nurses respected him not just for his professional demeanor, but for the way he carried himself. There was something about Marcus that commanded respect without demanding it. As he walked through the cardiac intensive care unit, he noticed unusual activity around room 314. Several doctors and nurses were moving in and out, their faces showing the kind of controlled urgency that Marcus recognized from his military days. Something serious was happening. Dr. Sarah Chen, the head of cardiology, spotted Marcus and waved him over. She looked tired, her usually neat hair slightly disheveled from what had clearly been a long night. "Marcus, we might need some help with crowd control later," she said quietly. "We have a patient in 314 who's been asking for security specifically. He's been here 3 days. And his condition is deteriorating rapidly." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "What kind of help does he need?" "He keeps saying he needs to speak with someone in uniform, someone military. The family mentioned he was a veteran, but they don't know much about his service. He's been agitated, asking for a soldier or Marine specifically." The request struck Marcus as unusual, but he had dealt with confused or distressed patients before. Sometimes elderly veterans would become disoriented and ask for their commanding officers or fellow soldiers. It was often a sign that the end was near. "I'll check on him during my rounds," Marcus assured Dr. Chen. As the morning progressed, Marcus found himself thinking about the patient in room 314. Something about the situation felt different from the typical cases he had encountered. The man wasn't just confused or calling out random military terms. According to the nurses, he was specifically asking for someone who would understand what he needed to say. Around 10 in the morning, Marcus decided to visit the room. He knocked softly and entered to find an elderly man lying in bed, connected to various monitors and machines. The man appeared to be in his 80s, with thin gray hair and deeply lined skin that spoke of a hard life. Despite his obvious illness, his eyes were alert and focused. "Sir, I'm Marcus Thompson, hospital security," Marcus said, approaching the bed. "I understand you wanted to speak with someone in uniform." The old man's eyes immediately fixed on Marcus's security uniform, taking in the military bearing and posture that 23 years of Marine service had ingrained in him. For a moment, neither man spoke. "You're military," the patient said. It wasn't a question but a statement of recognition. "Former Marine, sir. 23 years of service." The old man's expression changed, showing a mixture of relief and something else that Marcus couldn't quite identify. It looked almost like fear, but not the kind that came from being afraid of dying. This was different. "What's your name, son?" the old man asked, his voice weak but determined. "Sergeant Major Marcus Thompson, retired, sir." "My name is Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, retired Army, though most people here just know me as Jim." The old man struggled to sit up slightly, and Marcus instinctively moved to help him. As Marcus adjusted the pillows behind Colonel Morrison, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. On the nightstand next to the bed was a faded military photograph showing a much younger James Morrison in an Army uniform. But it wasn't just any Army uniform. The insignia and background suggested this photo was taken during the Vietnam War. "Colonel Morrison, sir, is there something specific you need to tell me?" Marcus asked, maintaining his respectful tone despite the growing unease in his stomach. The old man looked around the room as if checking to make sure they were alone. The constant beeping of the heart monitor seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed. "Sergeant Major Thompson, what I'm about to tell you might be hard to understand. But I need someone to know, someone who understands duty and honor." Marcus pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down, giving the colonel his full attention. In his years of military service and hospital security, he had learned that when a dying veteran wanted to talk, it was important to listen. "I'm listening, sir." Colonel Morrison closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his strength. When he opened them again, they held a weight that Marcus recognized from his own experiences with combat veterans. "In 1971, I was stationed in Vietnam. I was a young lieutenant then, barely 22 years old, leading a platoon in some of the most dangerous territory you could imagine. We were tasked with reconnaissance missions deep in enemy territory." Marcus nodded, understanding the significance of such missions. Vietnam reconnaissance was notoriously dangerous work. "There was one mission in particular, March 15, 1971. We were sent to gather intelligence on enemy troop movements near the Cambodian border. It was supposed to be a quick in-and-out operation. We weren't supposed to engage the enemy unless absolutely necessary." The old man paused, his breathing becoming more labored. Marcus waited patiently, sensing that whatever Colonel Morrison was about to reveal had been weighing on him for decades. "We came across a small village that wasn't supposed to be there. According to our maps and intelligence reports, the area should have been empty. But there it was, maybe 40 or 50 civilians living in makeshift shelters." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He had heard stories like this before, and they rarely ended well. "My orders were clear. If we encountered any unexpected situations, we were to radio for guidance and avoid contact. But our radio had been damaged during an ambush 2 days earlier. We were completely cut off from command." Colonel Morrison reached for a cup of water on his nightstand, his hands shaking slightly. Marcus helped him take a sip before he continued. "The village was being used as a supply route for enemy forces. We could see evidence of recent military activity. Fresh tire tracks from military vehicles, ammunition caches hidden in some of the huts. It was clearly a strategic location." The heart monitor's beeping seemed to accelerate slightly, matching what Marcus imagined was the colonel's increasing heart rate as he relived these memories. "I had to make a decision. My men were looking to me for leadership. We could either withdraw and potentially allow enemy forces to use this location to plan attacks on American troops, or we could act on what we observed." Marcus began to understand why this conversation was so difficult for the dying man. These were the kinds of impossible decisions that haunted soldiers long after wars ended. "I made the wrong choice, Sergeant Major Thompson. I made a choice that I've regretted every single day for the last 54 years. The room fell silent except for the steady rhythm of the medical equipment. Marcus waited, knowing that forcing the story would only make it harder for the colonel to continue. "I ordered my men to search the village for intelligence. We were supposed to be careful, to treat any civilians with respect, and follow the rules of engagement. But things went wrong very quickly." Colonel Morrison's eyes filled with tears, something Marcus had rarely seen from hardened veterans. "One of my soldiers, Private Rodriguez, was young and scared. When an elderly villager approached him quickly, speaking Vietnamese that none of us understood, Rodriguez panicked. He thought the man was reaching for a weapon." Marcus closed his eyes briefly, already knowing where this story was headed. "Rodriguez fired his weapon. The villager fell, and then everything fell apart. Other villagers started screaming and running. More of my men opened fire, thinking we were under attack." The old man was crying now, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "When the shooting stopped, 17 people were dead. Men, women, children, all civilians, all innocent people who were just trying to survive in a war they never asked for." Marcus felt the weight of this confession settling in his chest like a stone. He had known combat veterans who carried similar burdens, but hearing it firsthand from someone who was dying made it feel more real and more tragic. "We covered it up, Sergeant Major. We made it look like an enemy engagement. We filed reports claiming that we had been attacked by hostile forces and had defended ourselves. The Army accepted our story without question." Colonel Morrison looked directly into Marcus's eyes. "I've lived with this lie for 54 years. I've watched my men struggle with what we did. 3 of them committed suicide in the years following the war. 2 others became alcoholics and died young. The guilt destroyed all of us in different ways." Marcus remained silent, processing the magnitude of what he was hearing. This wasn't just a confession from a dying man. It was the revelation of a war crime that had been hidden for more than 5 decades. "I need someone to know the truth, Sergeant Major Thompson. Someone who understands the military and what it means to take responsibility for your actions. I can't take this to my grave." The colonel reached into his nightstand drawer and pulled out a small, worn notebook. "I've written down everything: names, dates, locations, details about the incident and the cover-up. I've also included contact information for the 2 surviving members of my platoon who are still alive." He handed the notebook to Marcus with trembling hands. "I need you to help me do the right thing. I need you to help me find a way to tell the truth before I die." Marcus held the notebook, feeling its weight both physically and emotionally. He understood that accepting this responsibility would change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. "Colonel Morrison, sir, this is a serious situation. If what you're telling me is true, there are people who should be informed. Families of the victims, military authorities, possibly the Vietnamese government." "I know, son. I know it's a lot to ask, but I've been carrying this burden alone for too long. I tried to reach out to military authorities several times over the years, but I always lost my courage. Now, with death so close, I can't wait any longer." Marcus looked at the notebook in his hands, then back at the dying colonel. "Sir, I need you to understand what you're asking me to do. This information could have serious legal and political implications. There could be consequences for you, for the surviving members of your platoon, and even for the military as an institution." Colonel Morrison nodded slowly. "I understand, Sergeant Major. I've thought about this every day for 54 years. I know there will be consequences, but doing nothing is no longer an option for me. I can't meet my maker carrying this secret." The 2 men sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the confession hanging between them like a heavy curtain. Marcus found himself thinking about his own military service, about the decisions he had made in combat, and about the code of honor that bound all soldiers together. Finally, he looked up at Colonel Morrison. "Sir, I'll help you find a way to tell the truth, but I need you to understand that once we start this process, there's no going back." "Are you absolutely certain this is what you want to do?" Colonel Morrison smiled for the first time since Marcus had entered the room. "Sergeant Major Thompson, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Thank you for listening. Thank you for understanding what this means." As Marcus prepared to leave the room, Colonel Morrison called out to him one more time. "Sergeant Major, there's one more thing you need to know. Something that might help you understand why this is so important to me." Marcus turned back, sensing that whatever the colonel was about to reveal would be even more significant than what he had already heard. Colonel Morrison's eyes took on a distant look, as if he were seeing something far beyond the hospital room walls. "One of the people who died that day was a young girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. She was hiding behind her grandmother when the shooting started." Marcus felt his heart sink even further. The involvement of a child made an already tragic situation exponentially worse. "I found her body after everything was over. She was still clutching a small wooden doll that her grandmother had been making for her. I took that doll, Sergeant Major. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could somehow honor her memory. Or maybe I just needed something to remind me of what we had done. The colonel reached under his pillow and pulled out a small, weathered wooden doll. It was clearly handmade, carved with simple tools but crafted with obvious love and care. The wood had darkened with age, and there were small chips and wear marks from decades of handling. I've carried this with me every day since March 15th, 1971. 54 years, Sergeant Major. Every morning when I wake up, I see her face. Every night before I go to sleep, I hold this doll and remember what my decisions cost that family. Marcus stared at the doll, understanding now why Colonel Morrison's burden had become unbearable. It was one thing to live with the knowledge of civilian casualties in war. It was another entirely to carry a physical reminder of an innocent child's death for more than 5 decades. Do you know her name, sir? The villagers called her Linh. It means gentle spirit in Vietnamese. I learned that later, when I started studying the language, trying to understand the people we had encountered that day. Marcus took the doll carefully, examining the simple but beautiful craftsmanship. He could see where the colonel's fingers had worn smooth grooves in the wood from years of handling. Colonel Morrison, returning this doll to her family would be an important part of making things right. Do you have any information about who her relatives might be? That's where things get complicated, Sergeant Major. I've been searching for her family for the past 30 years. I hired private investigators, contacted Vietnamese veteran organizations, even reached out to humanitarian groups working in Vietnam. I found the location of the village, but it was abandoned years ago. The colonel pointed to a section in his notebook. However, about 5 years ago, I finally made contact with someone who might be able to help, a Vietnamese-American social worker named Dr. Michelle Nguyen. She specializes in connecting Vietnamese war survivors with information about missing family members. Marcus looked up from the notebook. Did she find anything? She found records indicating that Linh had an older brother who survived the incident. He wasn't in the village that day because he had been sent to a nearby town to trade rice for medicine. His name was Duke, and according to Dr. Nguyen's research, he eventually made it to America as a refugee in 1975. This revelation sent a shock through Marcus. Not only had Colonel Morrison been carrying this burden for 54 years, but there was a survivor who had been living in the United States, possibly unaware of exactly what had happened to his family. Where is he now? That's the remarkable part, Sergeant Major. Duc Nguyen, Lin's brother, lives right here in Chicago. He's been here for almost 50 years. He owns a small restaurant in Chinatown called Saigon Memories. Marcus felt the weight of coincidence settling over the situation. After more than 5 decades, the colonel was dying in a hospital just miles away from the brother of the girl whose death had haunted him for his entire adult life. Have you contacted him? Colonel Morrison shook his head weakly. I've driven past his restaurant dozens of times over the past 5 years. I've sat in my car across the street trying to work up the courage to go inside. But how do you walk up to a man and tell him that you were responsible for killing his family? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus understood the colonel's paralysis. Some conversations were so difficult that they seemed impossible to begin. Dr. Nguyen offered to facilitate a meeting, but I kept putting it off. I kept telling myself I needed more time to figure out the right way to approach the situation. Now I'm out of time. Marcus looked at the medical equipment surrounding the bed, the clear indication that Colonel Morrison's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Dr. Chen had mentioned that his condition was critical, and looking at the man now, Marcus could see that he might only have days or weeks left. Sir, if you want to meet with Duc Nguyen, I can help arrange that. But I need to know what you hope to accomplish. Colonel Morrison struggled to sit up straighter, summoning energy from somewhere deep within his failing body. I want to return his sister's doll. I want to tell him exactly what happened that day without any of the lies or cover-up stories. I want to give him the truth about how his family died, and I want to apologize for the role I played in destroying his life." The simplicity and honesty of the colonel's goals struck Marcus as both admirable and heartbreaking. After 54 years of carrying this burden, the dying man wanted nothing more than to face the consequences of his actions and try to make whatever amends were still possible. "There's something else, Sergeant Major. Something that Dr. Nguyen told me about Duke that makes this even more important." Marcus waited for the colonel to continue. According to her research, Duke Nguyen has spent the past 50 years wondering exactly what happened to his family. The official Vietnamese government records from that time period are incomplete or missing. He knows they died during the war, but he's never known the specific circumstances. The revelation that Duke had been searching for answers about his family's death made the situation even more poignant. While Colonel Morrison had been living with the burden of knowing too much, Duke had been living with the pain of knowing too little. Dr. Nguyen said that Duke has contacted numerous veteran organizations and government agencies trying to find information about what happened in his village. He's been searching for the truth just as long as I've been hiding from it. Marcus closed the notebook and looked directly at Colonel Morrison. "Sir, I think you need to meet with Duke Nguyen as soon as possible. But I also think you need to be prepared for any reaction he might have. He might be grateful for the information, or he might be angry. He might want nothing to do with you, or he might want to know every detail." "I understand, son. I've thought about all those possibilities. Whatever his reaction, I owe him the truth. I owe him his sister's doll. And I owe him an apology that I should have given 54 years ago." Marcus stood up from his chair, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "Colonel Morrison, I'm going to contact Dr. Nguyen today. I'll explain the situation and ask her to reach out to Duke. But I want you to prepare yourself for the possibility that he might not want to meet with you. If he doesn't want to meet with me, I'll understand. But I hope Dr. Nguyen will at least give him his sister's doll and tell him that the American soldier who took it never forgot about her." As Marcus prepared to leave the room again, Colonel Morrison called out one final time. "Sergeant Major Thompson, there's something else, something that might help you understand why I'm asking you specifically to help me with this." Marcus turned back, wondering what other revelations this conversation might hold. "When I read your name tag earlier, when you first introduced yourself, I recognized your name. Not because I know you personally, but because I've seen your name in military records." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't imagine any connection between his own military service and Colonel Morrison's Vietnam experience. "I don't understand, sir. Your service record shows that you served in Iraq and Afghanistan. You received several commendations for your leadership under fire and for protecting civilian populations during combat operations." Marcus nodded, still not understanding the connection. "I've read reports about incidents where you went above and beyond to ensure that civilian casualties were minimized during military operations. In one particular case, you disobeyed direct orders from a superior officer because you believed those orders would result in unnecessary civilian deaths." The memory of that incident came flooding back to Marcus. It had happened in Afghanistan in 2009, during a particularly difficult period of his deployment. He had been ordered to clear a building that intelligence reports suggested was being used by insurgents, but his own reconnaissance had revealed that the building also contained civilian families. "You chose to face potential court-martial rather than follow orders that you believed would result in innocent people dying. That took courage, Sergeant Major. That took the kind of moral strength that I failed to show in Vietnam." Marcus felt uncomfortable with the praise, especially given the context of their conversation. "I did what I thought was right at the time, sir." "Exactly. You did what was right, even when it was difficult, even when it might have cost you your career. That's why I need your help with this situation. I need someone who understands the importance of doing the right thing, even when it's hard. Colonel Morrison reached out and grasped Marcus's hand with surprising strength. Will you help me contact Dr. Nguyen? Will you help me arrange a meeting with Duke? Will you help me finally do the right thing? Marcus looked into the old man's eyes and saw the desperation of someone running out of time to make amends for a lifetime of guilt. Yes, sir. I'll help you. I'll contact Dr. Nguyen today and explain the situation. If Duke is willing to meet with you, we'll arrange it as soon as possible. Relief washed over Colonel Morrison's face like a wave. Thank you, Sergeant Major Thompson. Thank you for giving me the chance to face my past. As Marcus left the hospital room, his mind was racing with the magnitude of what he had agreed to do. He was now responsible for facilitating a meeting between a dying American veteran and the brother of a Vietnamese girl who had been killed 54 years ago. The conversation could bring closure to both men, or it could open old wounds that might be better left undisturbed. He spent the rest of his shift thinking about the colonel's story and the weight of the responsibility he had accepted. By the time his shift ended, he had made several important decisions about how to proceed. Marcus drove home to his small apartment on the north side of Chicago, but instead of relaxing as he usually did after work, he immediately began researching Dr. Michelle Nguyen and her work with Vietnamese war survivors. What he found impressed him. Dr. Nguyen was a respected social worker who had dedicated her career to helping Vietnamese refugees and their descendants connect with their family histories. She had written several articles about the lasting trauma of war separation and the importance of truth-telling in the healing process. Marcus found her contact information and composed a careful email explaining Colonel Morrison's situation and his desire to meet with Duke Nguyen. He included details about the doll, the colonel's terminal illness, and the urgency of the situation. Within 2 hours, Dr. Nguyen responded with a phone number and a request to speak immediately. The conversation that followed would change everything. Dr. Michelle Nguyen's voice carried both professional calm and underlying emotion when she answered Marcus's call that evening. Mr. Thompson, I've been waiting for this phone call for 5 years. Colonel Morrison contacted me initially, but then he disappeared. I was beginning to think he had changed his mind about moving forward. Marcus explained the colonel's deteriorating condition and his renewed determination to meet with Duke Nguyen before he died. Dr. Nguyen, I need to understand something before we proceed. How do you think Duke will react to this information? The colonel is prepared for any response, but I want to make sure we handle this in a way that's respectful to everyone involved. There was a long pause before Dr. Nguyen responded. Mr. Thompson, there's something I need to tell you about Duke that will help you understand why this meeting is so important. Something that Colonel Morrison doesn't know. Marcus felt his stomach tighten with anticipation. Duck hasn't just been searching for information about his family's death. He's been living with a specific burden that makes Colonel Morrison's confession even more significant. Dr. Nguyen's voice became more serious. When Duke left the village that morning in March 1971, he was supposed to return by evening, but the trading took longer than expected, and he decided to stay overnight in the next town. He spent 54 years believing that if he had returned home when he was supposed to, he might have been able to protect his family. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Both Colonel Morrison and Duke Nguyen had been carrying guilt about the same tragic day, but from completely different perspectives. Duke has lived his entire life believing that his decision to stay away an extra night resulted in his family's death. He doesn't know that American forces were involved. He's been told that his village was attacked by enemy soldiers, but he doesn't know any details. Marcus realized that Colonel Morrison's confession could potentially free Duke from 54 years of misplaced guilt, even as it revealed the horrible truth about what had actually happened. Dr. Nguyen, do you think Duke will want to meet with the colonel? I think he needs to meet with him. But Mr. Thompson, there's something else you should know. something that makes this situation even more complicated. Marcus braced himself for another revelation. Duke has a son. His name is David Nguyen, and he's a veteran himself. He served 2 tours in Iraq with the Army. He's been helping his father search for information about what happened to their family. The involvement of another veteran added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. David has been very protective of his father over the years. He's seen how the uncertainty about his family's death has affected Duke, and he's been frustrated by the lack of concrete information. When I tell them about Colonel Morrison's desire to meet, David will want to be involved. Marcus understood the implications. David Nguyen would likely be suspicious of an American veteran who claimed to have information about his grandfather's family, especially if that information implicated American forces in their deaths. Dr. Nguyen, I think it would be best if you spoke with Duke and David first. Explain the general situation and gauge their interest in meeting. If they're willing, we can arrange something at the hospital. I agree. I'll contact them tonight and call you back tomorrow morning. But Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that regardless of how difficult this conversation might be, it's the right thing to do. Both of these men have been carrying burdens that they shouldn't have to carry alone. After ending the call with Dr. Nguyen, Marcus returned to the hospital to check on Colonel Morrison. He found the old man awake, staring at the ceiling with the wooden doll clutched in his hands. "How are you feeling tonight, sir?" Like a man who might finally be able to sleep peacefully for the first time in 54 years. "Were you able to reach Dr. Nguyen?" Marcus pulled up a chair and explained his conversation with the social worker, including the revelations about Duke's guilt and his son David's involvement. Colonel Morrison listened carefully, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. When Marcus finished, the old man was quiet for several minutes. So Duke has been blaming himself for not being there to protect his family. He's been carrying survivors' guilt just like I've been carrying perpetrators' guilt. That seems to be the case, sir. And his son is a veteran who served in Iraq. He'll understand military culture and the weight of combat decisions. Marcus nodded. Dr. Nguyen thinks David will be protective of his father, but she also believes he'll want to hear the truth. Colonel Morrison held up the wooden doll, examining it in the soft light from the bedside lamp. "You know, Sergeant Major, I used to imagine what I would say to Lynn's family if I ever had the chance. I rehearsed conversations in my head thousands of times. But now that it might actually happen, I realize that no words can really capture the magnitude of what we did that day. Sometimes the simple truth is more powerful than elaborate explanations, sir. I keep thinking about that little girl. She was so small, so innocent. She probably didn't even understand what war was or why there were soldiers in her village. And now I'm going to meet her brother and tell him that American soldiers killed her." The weight of the approaching conversation was clearly overwhelming for the dying colonel. "Sir, you're not just telling him that she died. You're giving him information that could help him understand that her death wasn't his fault. That might be the most important gift you can give him." Colonel Morrison looked at Marcus with something approaching hope in his eyes. "Do you really think so? I think the truth, no matter how painful, is better than a lifetime of wondering and self-blame." The next morning, Dr. Nguyen called Marcus with news about her conversation with Duke and David Nguyen. They want to meet with Colonel Morrison, tonight if possible, but they have some conditions. Marcus listened carefully as Dr. Nguyen explained the terms that the Nguyen family had requested. First, they want David to be present during the conversation. Second, they want me to be there as a mediator. Third, they want Colonel Morrison to bring any documentation or evidence he has about the incident. And finally, they want him to understand that they reserve the right to end the conversation at any time if it becomes too difficult. All of the conditions seemed reasonable to Marcus. "There's one more thing, Mr. Thompson. Duke asked specifically about the wooden doll. When I described it to him, he became very emotional. Apparently, he remembers his grandmother carving toys for Lynn, and he's been wondering for 54 years what happened to his sister's belongings. Marcus felt a surge of emotion, understanding how significant the return of that simple wooden doll would be for Duke. Dr. Nguyen, Colonel Morrison's condition is deteriorating. The doctors aren't sure how much time he has left. Can we arrange this meeting for tonight? I'll contact the hospital and arrange for a private conference room. This conversation needs to happen somewhere quiet and private, away from the normal hospital activity. That afternoon, Marcus briefed Colonel Morrison on the arrangements for the evening meeting. The old man had rallied somewhat, drawing energy from his determination to finally face the consequences of his actions. I've been thinking about what I want to say, Sergeant Major. I've written down some notes, but I think the most important thing is just to tell the truth simply and directly. Colonel Morrison showed Marcus a handwritten page with bullet points outlining the key facts of what had happened on March 15, 1971. I don't want to hide behind explanations about the fog of war or the confusion of combat. What we did was wrong, and I need to take responsibility for that. At 7 o'clock that evening, Marcus wheeled Colonel Morrison to a private conference room on the hospital's administrative floor. Dr. Nguyen was already there, along with two Vietnamese-American men who Marcus immediately recognized as father and son. Duke Nguyen was a small, elderly man in his 70s with gentle eyes and graying hair. Despite his age, he carried himself with dignity and quiet strength. His son David was taller and broader, with the bearing of a soldier and the protective instincts of a son who had watched his father struggle with loss for decades. The introductions were formal and tense. Marcus positioned Colonel Morrison's wheelchair so that he was facing Duke directly, with David and Dr. Nguyen sitting nearby. For several moments, nobody spoke. The weight of 54 years of grief, guilt, and unanswered questions filled the room like a heavy fog. Finally, Colonel Morrison broke the silence. Mr. Nguyen, my name is James Morrison. I was a lieutenant in the United States Army in 1971. I was the commanding officer of the platoon that killed your family. The directness of the confession seemed to shock everyone in the room except Marcus, who had expected the colonel to begin exactly this way. Duke Nguyen stared at Colonel Morrison for a long moment before responding in accented but clear English. I have waited 54 years to meet you. Colonel Morrison reached into his pocket and pulled out the wooden doll, holding it out toward Duke with trembling hands. I took this from your sister Lynn after she died. I've carried it with me every day since March 15th, 1971. I want to return it to you. Duke Nguyen took the doll with reverent care, his eyes filling with tears as he examined the familiar carving. My grandmother made this for Lynn. It was supposed to be finished for her 9th birthday. His voice broke slightly. She never had a 9th birthday. David Nguyen leaned forward, his expression intense. Colonel Morrison, we need to know exactly what happened. We've been searching for the truth for decades. Over the next hour, Colonel Morrison methodically explained the events of that March day in 1971. He described the mission, the discovery of the village, the broken radio, the impossible decisions, and the moment when everything went wrong. He didn't try to justify or excuse what had happened. He simply told the truth in clear, precise terms, accepting full responsibility for his role as commanding officer. When he finished, the room was silent except for the soft sound of Duke Nguyen crying as he held his sister's doll. Finally, Duke looked up at Colonel Morrison. For 54 years, I have blamed myself for not being there to protect my family. I have carried the guilt of a son who failed to save his loved ones. Colonel Morrison's own tears were flowing freely now. Mr. Nguyen, your family's death was not your fault. The responsibility belongs to me and my soldiers. You were 19 years old, trying to help your family survive. You couldn't have changed what happened. David Nguyen spoke for the first time in several minutes. "Colonel Morrison, my father has lived his entire life believing that he abandoned his family when they needed him most. Do you understand what that kind of guilt does to a person?" "I understand better than you might think, son. I've carried my own guilt about that day for the same 54 years. The two veterans looked at each other across the table, recognizing something familiar in each other's eyes. Dr. Nguyen intervened gently. "Both of you have been carrying burdens that have shaped your entire lives. Perhaps it's time to consider whether holding on to that guilt serves any purpose." Duke Nguyen wiped his eyes and looked directly at Colonel Morrison. "I do not forgive what you did to my family. I cannot forgive the death of innocent people. But I understand that you were a young soldier in an impossible situation, and I believe that you have suffered for your actions." Colonel Morrison nodded, accepting Duke's words without argument. "Mr. Nguyen, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm only asking that you understand that your family's death was not your fault, and that their memory has been honored by someone who has never forgotten them." Duke held up the wooden doll. "This doll has been touched by American hands every day for 54 years. In some way, my sister has been remembered and mourned by her killer. That is something I never expected to learn." The meeting continued for another hour, with both men sharing memories and emotions that they had never expressed before. David Nguyen gradually relaxed his protective posture as he saw that Colonel Morrison's confession was bringing his father a form of peace that decades of searching had failed to provide. As the evening wound down, Dr. Nguyen helped arrange for ongoing contact between the families. Colonel Morrison provided David with copies of all his documentation about the incident, and they discussed the possibility of pursuing official acknowledgement of what had happened. When it was time to leave, Duke Nguyen stood up and approached Colonel Morrison's wheelchair. "Colonel Morrison, I want you to know something. Tonight, for the first time in 54 years, I will sleep without wondering if I could have saved my family. You have given me that gift." Colonel Morrison looked up at the man, whose life he had inadvertently shaped through both violence and decades of silent remembrance. "Mr. Nguyen, your sister Lynn would have grown up to be a beautiful woman. She would have had children and grandchildren. She would have lived a full life. I'm sorry that my decisions took that possibility away from your family and from the world." Duke Nguyen placed his hand on Colonel Morrison's shoulder. "I believe my sister's spirit has been waiting for this moment. Now she can rest, and perhaps we can both find peace." As Marcus wheeled Colonel Morrison back to his hospital room that night, the old soldier seemed transformed. The weight that had pressed down on his shoulders for more than 5 decades appeared to have lifted. "Sergeant Major Thompson, I need you to help me with one more thing." "What's that, sir?" "I want to contact the families of the other soldiers who were in my platoon that day. The ones who are still alive need to know that the truth has finally been told. And the families of the ones who died carrying this burden need to know that their loved ones can finally rest in peace." Marcus understood that Colonel Morrison's confession was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a longer process of truth-telling and healing. 3 days later, Colonel James Morrison died peacefully in his sleep. His last conscious act had been to whisper 6 words to Marcus that would echo through both their lives. "Thank you for helping me salute first." In military tradition, junior officers salute first when encountering senior officers. But in the deeper sense of honor and courage, Colonel Morrison had finally saluted the truth first, giving precedence to moral courage over personal protection. The story of that meeting between Colonel Morrison and Duke Nguyen would eventually lead to a formal acknowledgement of the incident by military authorities and the establishment of a small memorial garden in Chicago dedicated to all victims of war, both American and Vietnamese. But for Marcus Thompson, the most important legacy of those 3 days was the understanding that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not facing an enemy in battle, but facing the truth about your own actions and accepting responsibility for the consequences, even when that acceptance comes 54 years too late. The wooden doll sits today in a place of honor in Duc Nguyen's restaurant, next to photographs of his family and a small plaque that reads, "In memory of all children lost to war, and in honor of all soldiers who choose courage over comfort." Marcus Thompson continues his work at Memorial Hospital, carrying with him the knowledge that sometimes the most important conversations happen not between the living and the living, but between the dying and those who must continue to live with the truth.